I found him at my gate on the worst night of the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a full decade, collapsed in a snowdrift already forming steadily over his legs, blood already freezing black against a wound along his ribs that told me plainly enough, even in that first frantic glance, he hadn't simply lost his way wandering blind in the storm. I never learned, until it was almost too late to matter, exactly how close I came to leaving him there in that drift to whatever fate the storm alone might have decided for him. Looking back, that's the choice this whole story turns on, and I've never once regretted making it, though I came close to wishing I had, more than once, before the whole hard truth of who he actually was finally caught up with both of us that winter. My homestead sat 6 miles from the nearest neighbor and closer to 9 full miles from the town of Larkspur proper, a distance that had felt like true freedom in the good months and like isolation in the bad, hard ones. 60 acres total of hard Wyoming ground along a creek that ran shallow even in the wet years. Michael and I had proved up the claim together fully 5 years before his death, building a modest but sturdy 2-room house with a good stone chimney, a barn just large enough for the 6 head of cattle and 2 good horses we could manage between us, and a life that had felt, for those 5 years, like exactly the kind of steady, unremarkable happiness a person builds slowly and doesn't fully appreciate until it's interrupted. The storm had been building since noon, the sky gone the particular flat gray that told anyone who'd wintered a season in that country to get the stock in and the doors barred before dark, and I'd been latching the last to the barn when I heard something over the wind that wasn't quite the sound a fence post makes when it gives way. I found him a few yards past my gate, face down in snow already drifting past his knees, and when I turned him over, I understood I was looking at a man who had perhaps another hour left in him if he stayed where he was, maybe less. His coat was torn through in 2 places, one where the bullet had grazed his ribs, and another that looked like it had caught on barbed wire during whatever desperate ride had brought him this far. And his boots, I noticed even in that first frantic moment, had a heel worked loose on one side. The kind of damage that came from miles of hard riding rather than a casual walk gone wrong. His face, what I could see of it beneath several days of beard growth and a mask of dried blood and snow, looked young enough to be someone's son, and old enough, in the particular weathered way of frontier men, to have survived a good deal of hardship already before this particular night added itself to the list. If I left him there, I would be the reason a man died within sight of my own porch light, and that was a weight I understood I couldn't carry, regardless of who he turned out to be or what had put him in that condition. I got him inside through main strength and stubbornness more than any real skill at hauling a grown man's dead weight across snow already knee-deep and rising, and by the time I had him on a pallet near the stove, cutting away a bloodied shirt to look at the wound beneath more closely by lamplight, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to stop twice and simply breathe before I trusted them enough to continue the work. The wound along his ribs was a bullet graze, deep enough to have bled heavily, but shallow enough, I judged after careful examination, not to have hit anything vital that would kill him outright if it didn't fester badly. I cleaned it as best I understood how, packed it with what clean cloth I had, and sat up with him through the worst of that first night, feeding the stove and listening to the wind try the shutters, not knowing whether I'd wake to find him alive or not fully understanding yet why I found myself hoping so hard for the former. I'd learned rough field doctoring over the years, the hard way, patching Michael and later myself through the ordinary accidents a working homestead produces. A gashed hand from wire, a badly sprained ankle, once a broken finger I'd had to splint myself with a neighbor woman's guidance shouted through a snowstorm not unlike this one. None of that experience felt remotely adequate to a bullet wound in a stranger I knew nothing about, and I remember praying, somewhere in those first hours, less for any particular outcome than simply for the strength to make the next necessary decision without second-guessing myself into paralysis. He woke sometime past midnight, fever-bright eyes finding mine in the low stove light, and the first thing he did, weak as he clearly was try to sit up and reach for a gun that wasn't there, having apparently lost it somewhere in the snow between wherever he'd come from and my gate. I told him plainly that he was safe, that I'd tended his wound, that he wasn't going anywhere in his condition regardless of what he was reaching for a gun to defend against. He looked at me a long moment, something calculating and exhausted both working behind his eyes, before he said in a low, guarded voice that safe wasn't a word he'd trust from a stranger until he understood a good deal more about what she wanted from him, his hand still searching weakly at his side for a weapon that simply wasn't there to be found. My own wound, the one that made trust in a stranger both harder and somehow easier than it should have been, went back 2 years, to my husband Michael's death, thrown from a wagon on an icy road not unlike the one that had nearly killed the stranger now lying in my front room. I had spent those 2 years running the homestead alone, 60 acres of hard Wyoming ground that took more from a person than it gave back most seasons, and I had built, in that time, a particular hard shell of self-sufficiency that made asking for help or extending trust feel almost like admitting defeat. Something about finding a man half dead at my own gate, in a storm not unlike the one that had taken Michael, had cracked that shell in a way I didn't fully understand until days later.
I'd told myself, in those 2 years since Michael's death, that a widow who let herself need anyone else's help was a widow who'd eventually be disappointed by it. That the safest kind of life was one built entirely on what my own 2 hands could manage. That conviction had cost me plenty over the 2 years. I'd turned down help mending a collapsed section of fence rather than owe a neighbor a favor. I'd nursed my own bout of fever alone rather than send for help I'd have to repay somehow. And I'd grown, without fully noticing the growing, into a woman considerably more isolated than the 60 acres and 9 miles to town strictly required. Something about Wes arriving at my gate too weak and too desperate for me to maintain any of that careful distance had knocked a hole clean through habits I hadn't realized had calcified quite so thoroughly. He gave his name as Wes, nothing more at first, and I didn't press for more than that, understanding that a man in his condition, found in the state I'd found him, likely had reasons for guarding whatever else there was to know. The days that followed settled into a careful, watchful rhythm, me tending the wound and bringing what food I could spare, him healing slowly and saying little, both of us circling around the plain question of how he'd come to be bleeding in a blizzard without either one of us quite ready to ask or answer it directly. The storm kept us snowbound together for the better part of a week, the roads impassable, the drifts too deep for any wagon or even a determined horse to manage safely. And in that week, something began building between us that had nothing to do with the careful watchfulness either of us had started with. He told me on the 3rd night about growing up on a failed homestead in Kansas, about a father who'd drunk away what little the land produced, about learning early that a man survived on this frontier by trusting almost no one and depending on nothing but his own 2 hands. He described the particular shame of watching his father sell off livestock piece by piece to cover debts that never seemed to shrink no matter what was sacrificed to pay them, and how he'd left home at 16 with nothing but a saddle and a determination never to end up dependent on anyone or anything the way his father had ended up dependent on whiskey and other men's patience. He'd worked cattle drives and mining camps, and eventually security work for outfits willing to pay a steady man who didn't ask too many questions, drifting from job to job across 3 territories in the years since, never staying anywhere long enough to be known well by anyone, which he said, with a rueful edge to his voice, had turned out to be exactly the kind of life that left a man with no one willing to vouch for him when Garrity's lie needed contradicting. I told him about Michael,
about the particular loneliness of running 60 acres alone, about the 2 years I'd spent telling myself independence and isolation were the same thing, when really they'd never been. He asked me that same third night whether I regretted staying on alone rather than selling the claim and moving somewhere with more people around to share the work and the worry. I told him I'd considered it more than once, especially that first winter, but that something stubborn in me had refused to let Michael's 5 years of work simply be sold off to the first buyer willing to take it off a widow's hands for less than it was worth. He said he understood that particular stubbornness better than most, having watched his own father lose a homestead not to hardship but to simply giving up too early, and that whatever else might be said about the choices that had put him bleeding at my gate, he respected a person who chose to keep fighting for something rather than walk away from it. The first emotional peak came on the 5th night when his fever spiked hard and dangerous, the wound showing the first ugly signs of the infection I'd been dreading since that first night. I sat up with him through hours of delirium, sponging him down, forcing what fluids I could get him to take, listening to him mutter fragments of things that made no clear sense at the time. A name, Gity, said with real fear rather than fever nonsense. A reference to a bank in a town I didn't recognize. A repeated insistence, even in his half-conscious state, that he hadn't done what they said he'd done, though I had no clear idea yet what that meant. I remember the particular terror of those hours, watching a man I'd known less than a week thrash and mutter through a fever I had no real means of fighting beyond cool water and whatever strength of will I could lend him through the simple act of staying present. I'd lost track of how many times I refilled the basin, how many times I pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, only to have him toss it away moments later. How many times I found myself talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, simply to give him something to anchor toward through the delirium. Somewhere in those hours, I stopped thinking of him as a stranger I'd taken in out of plain decency, and started thinking of him as someone whose survival had become, without my fully deciding it, a thing I badly needed. He turned to look at me sometime near dawn, the fever finally breaking. Exhaustion and something else plain on both our faces, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I felt something in my chest go still and waiting, the particular held breath feeling of a moment about to become something else entirely. And then a sound reached us both at once, faint through the storm's dying wind. Hoofbeats, several riders, approaching slow and careful through drifts that hadn't fully settled, and whatever had been building in that quiet dawn dissolved instantly into a fear neither of us had time to name before it arrived at my door. I answered the knock to find Marshal Cutter standing on my porch with 2 deputized men behind him, all 3 half-frozen and grim, asking whether I'd seen any sign of a man matching a description that fit the one lying feverish behind my own bedroom door with a precision that made my stomach drop. Cutter himself cut an imposing figure, even half-frozen, iron-gray hair beneath a wide black hat crusted with snow, a heavy wool coat that had clearly seen better days than this particular ride, and a silver territorial badge pinned prominently enough at his chest that there could be no mistaking his authority. He spoke with the particular clipped economy of a man who delivered this same set of questions at every homestead between Larkspur and my gate, and expected by now mostly the same unhelpful answers, though his eyes moved past me into my front room with a thoroughness that told me he hadn't grown careless despite the repetition. He said the man was wanted for robbing the Territorial Bank in Larkspur and killing a teller in the process, that he'd been tracked as far as the ridge above my property before the storm had erased his trail, and that any homesteader harboring a fugitive of that magnitude, knowingly or not, would answer for it under territorial law, regardless of whatever reasonable excuse they offered afterward. I lied to a lawman's face for the first time in my life, standing on that porch with my heart going hard enough I was certain he could hear it, telling him I'd seen no one, that the storm had kept me too occupied with my own stock to notice strangers on the ridge, and I watched him weigh that answer with the particular sharp scrutiny of a man whose whole profession depended on knowing when someone was lying to him. His two deputies stood a step behind him the whole conversation, saying nothing, watching my face with the particular flat attention of men trained to notice exactly the kind of small tell I was working hard not to give them. A hesitation, a glance toward the house, anything that might contradict the steady denial I was offering. I kept my eyes fixed on Cutter's own and my voice as level as I could manage, drawing on some reserve of composure I hadn't known I possessed until that exact moment demanded it of me. All while acutely aware that Wes lay not 30 feet behind me, feverish and unable to stay quiet if the conversation dragged on much longer. He let it go, eventually, some combination of the storm's continuing fury and my own carefully steady voice buying enough doubt to send him and his men on toward the next homestead over. But I understood, watching them ride off into the driving snow, that I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and that I'd done it for a man whose actual guilt or innocence I still had no real proof of either way. I stood on that porch a long while after they'd disappeared into the storm, my legs unsteady beneath me now that the immediate danger had passed, turning over the particular strangeness of what I'd just done. I had lived 31 years as a person who told the truth as a matter of basic principle, who'd never once, that I could recall, lied outright to someone in a position of authority. And the ease with which the lie had come, steady-voiced and convincing, frightened me nearly as much as the marshal's visit itself had. The dark turn came from that uncertainty itself. I confronted Wes that evening, once the marshal's party was well clear of the property, demanding plainly that he tell me the truth of what had happened in Larkspur, because I had just lied to territorial law on his behalf without knowing whether I'd protected an innocent man or made myself an accomplice to murder. He was quiet a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes, before he told me the whole of it. That he'd been hired as extra security for a cattle shipment passing through Larkspur. That a robbery had occurred at the bank the same week he happened to be in town. That a man named Gity, the actual robber, had planted evidence and spread word implicating Wes specifically because Wes had once beaten him fair in a card game Gity had never forgiven. The game itself a small thing at the time, a few dollars won off a man who'd accused him of cheating without any evidence to back the accusation. An argument that had nearly come to blows before cooler men in the saloon separated them. And that the killed teller had been shot by Gity's own hand, while Wes had been 3 streets over at the time, a fact no one in Larkspur had been willing to verify on his behalf once Gity's version of events had taken hold first. He told me Gity had spread word through the saloon before the marshal's office had even finished its initial investigation, painting a picture convincing enough that by the time Wes tried to explain his own whereabouts, half the town had already decided his guilt over a card game grudge dressed up as righteous certainty. He said the particular cruelty of it wasn't the accusation itself, but the speed with which people he'd known for years, men he'd shared drinks and work with, had simply accepted the easier story without once asking him directly what had actually happened, as though 3 years of decent conduct in that town counted for nothing against one man's confident lie. I told him I wanted to believe him, and that wanting to wasn't the same as being certain. And he said with a bitterness I hadn't heard from him before that he understood exactly how that uncertainty felt, having watched an entire town choose the easier story over the truth without once asking him for his side of it. That conversation left something strained between us for 2 full days, both of us moving carefully around a trust that had cracked under the weight of a question neither of us could fully resolve with words alone. I found myself, during those 2 strained days, watching him with a wariness I hadn't felt since that very first fevered night, second-guessing every kind word he'd offered me over the previous week, as though it might have been calculated rather than sincere. He, for his part, gave me space rather than pressing for the trust he clearly wanted restored, tending to small chores around the house despite his healing wound, as though proving his usefulness might somehow substitute for proving his innocence, an effort I noticed and appreciated even while I remained unable for those 2 days to fully set my doubt aside. The turning point came unexpectedly, on the 7th day, when a second rider arrived at my gate. Not the marshal this time, but a lean, hard-eyed man who introduced himself falsely as a concerned citizen searching for a lost relative, though something in his manner set my instincts on edge the moment he dismounted. A wrongness I couldn't have named precisely, but felt as surely as I'd felt the cold coming off that first blizzard. Wes, watching from the shuttered window, went pale and still in a way I hadn't seen even during the marshal's visit, and told me in an urgent whisper that the man at my gate was Gity himself, come to finish what the robbery and the false accusation had started, unwilling to risk Wes surviving long enough to tell his side of the story to anyone who might actually listen. I studied Gity through the gap in the shutters while Wes whispered what little he knew of the man. Lean and hard-eyed, just as Wes had described, sitting his horse with the particular loose confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than reasoned argument, his gaze sweeping my property with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with searching for any actual lost relative. I understood, watching him, that I was looking at a man capable of exactly what Wes claimed he'd already done once, and that whatever fear I'd felt facing Marshal Cutter's official scrutiny was a pale thing next to what I felt now, facing a man with considerably less regard for law or consequence. I sent Gity away with a story about my own husband being due back any minute from checking the far pasture, a lie delivered with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I watched him ride off with an expression that told me plainly he hadn't fully believed me, that he'd be back, and that the next visit would likely come with less patience for a widow's convenient excuses. My hands were shaking again once he was fully out of sight, worse than they'd shaken that first night hauling Wes in from the drift, and I stood at the window a long while watching the empty road, half expecting to see him circle back before I'd even finished catching my breath. Wes, when I finally turned from the window, had pulled himself upright against the wall despite his wound, a length of stove wood gripped in one hand as though he'd meant to defend us both if Gity had forced his way in, a gesture that told me plainly how seriously he'd taken the danger, even in his weakened state. That encounter, more than anything Wes had told me directly, convinced me of the truth of his story, because an innocent man's real robber does not ride out through a dying blizzard to personally silence a witness who has already been condemned by everyone else's assumptions. I found Wes that night, sitting up despite his healing wound, working out some plan to leave before Gity returned, convinced that staying endangered me as much as it endangered him. I told him plainly that I wasn't willing to let him ride out weak and unarmed into a territory that had already convicted him without trial, that whatever risks staying carried, I'd rather face it with the truth on my side than let him disappear into a storm that would likely finish what Gity's bullet had started, my voice steadier than I actually felt saying it, though I meant every word regardless. I told him, too, though the words came harder than I expected, that these 7 snowbound days had become something I wasn't willing to simply let ride away, whatever came of it. He was quiet a long moment in the low stove light, the same quiet I remembered that first fevered night, before he told me something that reframed the whole week between us. He said he'd spent 3 years since the robbery moving from place to place, trusting no one, certain that the first person he tried to trust would either turn him in for the bounty or believe the easier story the same way Larkspur had. he said, watching me lie to a territorial marshal on his behalf and then watch me stand steady in front of Garrity himself had taught him something he hadn't let himself believe in 3 years of running, that a person could still choose to trust the harder, truer story over the easier lie, even when the cost of that choosing was real and immediate. I asked him, sitting there in the low stove light with the whole week's danger and tenderness both catching up to me at once, what he intended to do now, whether he still meant to ride out weak and unarmed rather than risk my safety further. He said he'd meant to, right up until I'd told him plainly that I wasn't willing to let him keep running alone, though he hadn't known how badly he needed to hear it until I'd said it, sitting there in that low stove light with his voice rougher than I'd yet heard it, as though the admission cost him something considerable to make out loud.
The resolution came together over the following week, built not on a single dramatic confrontation, but on careful, deliberate planning that both of us worked through together late into several nights. I rode into town myself once the roads cleared enough to travel safely, carrying a written account Wes had prepared of everything he knew about Garrity's movements and the card game grudge behind the frame-up, and I delivered it directly to Marshal Cutter, along with my own testimony about Garrity's visit to my gate under false pretenses, an act that any innocent search for a lost relative had no plausible reason to include. Cutter, to his considerable credit, took the account seriously enough to send men back to Larkspur to re-examine the robbery evidence with Garrity specifically in mind. And within 2 weeks, a second witness came forward, a stable hand who'd seen Garrity near the bank at the exact hour the teller was killed, too frightened of Garrity's temper to have spoken up until word reached him that Cutter was actively investigating an alternative suspect. Cutter himself rode back out to my homestead once the stable hand's testimony had been taken down formally, sitting across my own kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an expression considerably less grim than the one he'd worn on that first snowbound visit, to tell me plainly that he'd suspected, even during that first interrogation on my porch, that he'd suspected that I'd been lying to him, and that he'd let it go not out of any carelessness, but because something in my manner had convinced him the lie was covering something more complicated than simple guilt. He said a good lawman learned, over enough years, to trust that particular instinct as much as he trusted hard evidence, and that mine had turned out to be worth trusting. Garrity was arrested within the month, the case against Wes formally dropped, and the whole affair concluded with considerably less drama than the storm and the manhunt that had launched it, which suited both Wes and me entirely fine. He stayed on at the homestead through that spring, helping with work I'd been managing alone for 2 years, the two of us settling into a rhythm that had nothing left to hide behind and everything to build honestly instead.
The work itself came easier with 2 sets of hands managing it. Fence lines mended in half the time they'd once taken me alone. The spring planting finished a full 2 weeks ahead of my usual pace. The small herd of cattle looking healthier by early summer than they had in the 2 years since Michael's death. But it wasn't the practical ease of shared labor that mattered most to me that spring, so much as the particular steady comfort of simply not being alone in the daily weighing of decisions that running a homestead required. Whether to sell a calf early or hold it through another season, whether the well needed deepening before the dry months hit, or whether a suspicious cloud bank on the horizon warranted bringing the stock in early. Having someone to weigh those questions alongside, someone whose judgment I'd come to trust through the hardest week either of us had lived through, changed the whole character of the work in ways I hadn't anticipated. We were married the following autumn, in a small ceremony at the same homestead where I'd once dragged a half-dead stranger in from a blizzard without knowing whether I was saving an innocent man or endangering myself for a killer. Marshal Cutter, of all people, rode out for the wedding, having become, in the months since Garrity's arrest, something closer to a friend than either of us would have predicted that first cold night he stood on my porch asking pointed questions I'd lied my way through. The wedding itself was small, held in my own front room with only a handful of neighbors and Cutter present. The same room where I'd once sat up through a fever-racked night, not knowing whether the stranger on my pallet would survive until morning. I found something fitting in that, marrying Wes in the exact space where I'd first chosen to trust him. The stove that had warmed him through that first desperate night, now warming a room full of people who'd come to celebrate rather than investigate. Cutter gave a short, characteristically blunt toast at the small gathering afterward, observing that he'd tracked plenty of men through plenty of storms in his years as marshal, but that this was the first time the trail had led him somewhere he was glad, in the end, not to have found what he'd originally been hunting for.
Wes told me once, sometime after the wedding, that he still thought about that gate some nights. The particular cold of that snowdrift. The certainty settling over him in those last conscious moments that he was going to die there, unknown and unbelieved. He said what he remembered most clearly wasn't the cold itself, but the exact moment my porch light had come into view through the storm, a small, warm point in all that freezing dark, and how he'd used the last of his strength crawling toward it, without any real hope that whoever lived behind it would open the door to a stranger bleeding in the snow. He told me, too, about the particular clarity that comes to a person convinced they're about to die, how the 3 years of running and hiding and being disbelieved had suddenly seemed like less important things to have spent his last thoughts on than the plain, simple hope that somewhere ahead of him was a door that might open. He said he hadn't been thinking of justice or clearing his name in those last conscious moments, crawling toward my gate, only of warmth and the small mercy of not dying entirely alone in a stranger's snowdrift, with no one ever knowing what had actually happened to him. I told him I'd have opened that door for anyone that night, regardless of who they turned out to be. He said he knew that now, and that it was exactly the reason he'd trusted me before he'd had any sense left to trust anyone at all. Some nights still, when a storm rolls hard down off the ridge the way that first one did, I find myself standing at the same window where I once watched Marshal Cutter ride off into the snow, remembering the particular fear and certainty of that whole strange week. How close the story had come to ending differently at nearly every turn. If I'd hesitated another few minutes at the gate, if Cutter had pressed harder on that first visit, if Gity had arrived a day earlier while Wes was still too weak to warn me. Wes says he doesn't dwell on those close calls the way I sometimes do, that a man who spent 3 years running from an unfair ending has less patience for imagining the ones that didn't happen than for simply being grateful for the one that did. I've come around mostly to agreeing with him, though I still light the porch lamp every night without fail, storm or clear sky both, a habit neither of us has ever needed to discuss the reason for.